welcome to the Africa for Palestine webinar series. I'm very excited to be speaking with Janine Khalek, who will be taking us inside the world of the newsroom and discussing Palestine in the media. By way of introduction, Africa for Palestine is a human rights organization in South Africa, working within the continent to raise awareness for Palestinian issues and to push back Israeli influence. We work with various organizations in solidarity with Palestine throughout the continent. And in this webinar series, we speak with activists, leaders, academics, and reporters. We are honored to have Australian investigative journalist with us today, Janine Khalek. So let's begin by finding out what it was like to be a Palestinian growing up in Australia.
Hi, thanks so much. Thanks for having me. I'm truly honored. Before I jump into that, I just wanted to acknowledge the land that I'm on. I'm currently on Gadigal country, and this is Aboriginal land from which I talk to you today. Today also happened to be Invasion Day, so it marked 233 years since the violent British colonisation and ethnic cleansing of our Indigenous brothers and sisters. I'd also like to acknowledge the work of Africa for Palestine and pay my respects to everyone who fought against apartheid in South Africa and continue to fight against the endemic racism and the long-term effects of apartheid and colonization. So being a Palestinian in Australia has been quite interesting, I suppose. I've had to kind of deal with the dichotomy, especially as I've gotten a bit older, with being a settler on Indigenous land, while also having my parents and my grandparents driven out from their land because they were obviously exiled by settlers. So my parents were refugees. They came to Australia not as refugees, they were stateless. My father was born and grew up in a refugee camp in Lebanon, and my mother was born in the Emirates. And so they were stateless. And they came to Australia during the 80s. So I didn't really have a consciousness of being Palestinian when I was younger. My parents were always working, and I believe they were protecting myself and my siblings, trying to, I suppose, give us a normal, quote unquote, normal upbringing. So there wasn't anything that was, I suppose, explicitly Palestinian or that I could identify growing up. It wasn't until I guess I started asking questions when I was a young teenager, but we sort of kind of got included, and this would happen at school, I suppose, with just the rest of the Arabs that live here. So it's a very small population. I do feel, more far away, I think, than the rest of Palestinians who happen to live in the diaspora. And I guess another aspect of growing up Palestinian in Australia and, currently being Palestinian in Australia is, as cheesy and corny as it sounds, there's a lot of homesickness for Palestine, which I've been, fortunate to have been to twice. And I say fortunate loosely, but because it should be our right to go and return and to be there. So, yeah.
Wow, that's a very interesting dichotomy. Did you go for work or was it personal?
It was personal when I went to Palestine. Yeah. So it was about, I also have quite a few elders, including some of my uncles and my father, who still to this day refuse to go to Palestine out of this, I suppose, a principle in that they don't want to recognize the state of Israel, even though they have every right to. They are refugees. They are adamant about not going. And I think some of that is also connected to a kind of trauma and not wanting to see what's happened to our land.
Yeah. Okay, and we'll get back into that shortly. I just wanted to ask you, so today you refer to yourself as a reformed journalist. So can you tell us a little bit more about that and why you've chosen to use that word in particular?
Yeah, so I was a journalist for about 8 years. Full disclosure, I've left working in newsrooms about a year and a bit ago now. And I'd been working in local and national newsrooms. And I still deep down consider myself a journalist and a storyteller because I mean, the heart of journalism, I believe, is holding power to account and telling the stories of people who can't tell their stories, who aren't able to. So I've called myself a reform journalist before in light of the way Western and Australian newsrooms operate, which is the sort of the only experience I've had, because there's this idea that I guess to be a journalist, one must be, I guess the idea and the myth of objectivity that we have, that you have to approach a story by looking at both sides and not critically taking in the fact that, say, when it comes to Palestine and the Israeli state, that there is a huge power imbalance. And I've also have been, I suppose, an unorthodox journalist for a really long time because I'm unapologetically myself and don't hide what I think and what I am. I believe a lot of journalists take themselves incredibly serious and they're almost robotic because they're trying to project this unbiased, objective facade to give off this look as though they are, the guardians of information dispersion, which is quite frankly bullshit. And we also associate being an objective journalist with being a white journalist, and particularly here in Australia. So white journalists who, of course, are biased, who, of course, have their prejudices, who, of course, are objective, as all humans are considered the untainted objective default, and that's highly problematic. So I suppose I've used the term in order to distance myself from how we understand journalists today.
Right. And so, like, when you're in the newsroom and trying to be objective, how have you found that who you are affects not only the newsroom, but the kind of content that gets put out by a newsroom? I mean, how do you separate your identity, your culture, and bring diversity into a newsroom when that's not particularly welcomed?
Yeah, I mean, what I would do, for example, if I was working on, any story, for example, that needed, say, a case study and needed to involve experts, I would try to reach out to the non-usual people that journalists often go to, or to people who live outside the areas, sort of the, I guess, affluent areas, or some poorer regional areas, but where there's no, say, cultural diversity. I would sort of make a point to reach out and speak to people like that and sort of tell their stories.
Okay. And now that you're reporting independently, what has that been like? I mean, what are some of the challenges and also the benefits that you've experienced?
Yeah, there have been many challenges. I suppose even when I was working within newsrooms, I had always considered myself, or at least felt or was perceived even, as an independent journalist, because I was often considered, I suppose, heretical for breaking off and tweeting, independently and saying and sharing the stories that I wanted, and in particular pitching stories on Palestine when generally there was, zero interest from editors and colleagues. But it's been, it's been the benefits, I would say, right now is that I don't feel like I am beholden to the pressure that is felt by editors in newsrooms everywhere to Zionist lobby groups who, for years, I mean, when I started working at a national outlet, after I'd been at some local outlets for a couple of years, I was still a baby journalist. I was about 21, and a young 21-year-old Palestinian who was trying to make a career for herself. I was constantly intimidated by Zionist lobby groups here in Australia who, until the very end of my newsroom career, would be liaising with my editors and pushing for me to be fired, to be ousted, to be punished. And the amount of meetings I had to go into with my editors would be like, Janine, that article that you shared about what was happening in Gaza, just delete it, or just be careful. Don't post these things. You don't want to draw the ire of these groups. So they quietly stood by me, but there's no other way of looking at it, that they were feeling constantly pressured. And I mean, a lot of them think that the trouble isn't worth it. So it's a small sacrifice to make to not pursue the question and topic of Palestine or Palestine related issues whatsoever. Yeah.
Wow. So that's not only in your career, but in your personal capacity as well.
Yeah. So in my personal capacity, I would say, the only way that I was privy to the pressure that was being applied on my editors and the targeting that was used against me, like the dossiers of tweets and things that they had found out about me that were handed to my editors. The only way I knew about that was because I was in those newsrooms and I was sort of, reprimanded or brought in, and I was told about it. At this point, I don't know. I mean, I am for certain that I'm monitored, and they keep track of what I'm doing. But I try and just ignore it. I mean,
Right.
What are they going to do? What are they going to say? Yeah.
Okay. And you recently had some flack on Twitter about a situation with a professor there in Australia. Can you tell everyone a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I guess this is in relation to the silencing in newsrooms.
Yeah.
Right. And even in academia. Well, with Professor Tim Anderson, who was at the University of Sydney, I guess I don't agree with a lot of his views, to be honest. When in regards to, say, Syria, for example, I just want to put that on the table. But when he's come out to be very frank about Palestine and apartheid, I mean, he's had to pay for it, right, with his career, or so he alleges. But I would also like to take a look at more global situations with, say, Professor Steve Salater, a Palestinian American academic who was fired from the University of Illinois because he said Israel was an apartheid state. Yeah, and you have the likes of the University of Toronto. Just recently, their law school blocked the hiring of a scholar. Her name is Valentina Zarova, due to her scholarly work on Israel's human rights abuses. And so she wasn't reporting, she wasn't giving an opinion. Not that that should be an issue, of course, because I think any human being with a spine should have an opinion about what's going on. But this was just her body of work and her area of research. And all her peers supported her and supported her in taking the role and heading it's an international human rights program. But there was pressure from ardent staunch Zionists, which is what happened. I don't know the full details with Tim Anderson's situation, but that's definitely what happened with Steve Salater. That's definitely what happened with Valentina Azarova. It's definitely what happened with the Black American academic Mark Lamont Hill for saying that Palestine will be free from the river to the sea, or that Palestine, just acknowledging the fact that Palestine is from the river to the sea, and he was fired by CNN just in the last couple of years. So there is there's a lot to lose if you are Palestinian or stand up for Palestinian human rights when you engage with, I suppose, the mainstream media, or if you're within academia. They've made it really clear that there is no space for you, and you're not welcome in this space, and that any criticism of Israel, that any anti-Zionist critique is considered anti-Semitic. And so this continued weaponization has, existed since time immemorial, right? But it's also gaining more ground now that if you've heard about the IHRA definition on anti-Semitism. So it's forgive me for not recalling the exact name of the acronym, but the International Holocaust something. So they have a 38-word working definition on what anti-Semitism is, and it's a good definition. It's about racism against Jewish people, which we should all obviously stand against. However, under the IHRA definition, they've given 11 examples about what is considered anti-Semitism, and this has been adopted by some states. In Canada, you've got the opposition party here in Australia. The Labor Party has also adopted it. They've also been, the Zionist lobby groups here, the Zionist Federation of Australia has been lobbying the ABC, which is our public broadcaster here in Australia, to adopt this definition. And so the examples under this definition include criticizing Israel, calling Israel an apartheid state, even likening some of the crimes against humanity with Nazi Germany. I mean, not necessarily complaining and saying that these are exactly the same thing went down, of course not, but in substance, to say that is now deemed anti-Semitic according to this definition. And what's really troubling is that they are hoping to have this enshrined officially within a number of institutions. And it's already hard enough as it is, because that is the de facto definition right now. This is what we work under, but this is a means to legitimize that.
Right, and that makes it so difficult. And that goes beyond the fact that the narrative is just complicated, so people try to veer away from it. I'm wondering how you think this relates to the theory that what is said by the media becomes the reality, it becomes the actual lived narrative. Do you think it's true, and how does that relate to the news on Palestine? How do we rehumanize and uncomplicate it for people?
I truly wish I knew, but of course, the theory that what is said by the media becomes the narrative. And I mean, this was first fashioned by the Italian philosopher and Marxist thinker, Antonio Gramsci, who talks about media hegemony and how reporters, through the dominant ideas and values that exist today, decide what news stories are covered and what isn't. So this shapes what we see every day, and in doing so, that also structures the narrative, of course. And the prevailing discourse, again, as I mentioned earlier, is that anti-Zionism and any criticism of Israel and its human rights abuses, its military occupation of Palestinians, its displacement, its, the list is endless, is anti-Semitism. And that has always been the case. So I'll give you a story. I mean, I'll give you a couple of stories from my experience as, a journalist. I've been on the receiving end of quite a bit of anti-Palestinian racism, amongst colleagues within newsrooms. So I had once was commissioned to write a story, and it was an art story, right? It was about a Palestinian refugee who was a refugee in Ramallah. He was displaced originally from 48, who was coming to Australia to join a Sydney orchestra group. So he sings in classical Arabic, and there are some European classical music that's paired with it. And he was touring parts of New South Wales. And so I spoke to him for the story. Basically, it was just spruiking that this was happening. It was for the art section. So it wasn't, a front page story or anything like that. This was just a cultural event. And I had mentioned in the story, and it, to quote him, who tells me, I'm Palestinian, I'm from Palestine, it's such an honor to be able to travel and do what I love. And so that was typed up, copy done, interview done, sent in. And one sub-editor who had very little to do with, and now sub-editors sit behind the editors, right? So sub-editors are nameless. They're the ones who are making edits to stories and most of the time ensuring that what you've written makes sense, that it's correct, that there aren't any spelling errors, that your syntax is okay. And so this sub-editor stormed up to me and had a printed copy of the story and slammed it on my desk. And he completely lost it. He was like, Palestine does not exist. And I was obviously very taken aback, because I suppose a lot of the things that I had experienced were quite, implicit and insinuated. And I had known through my editors and people that I was working with, even with other colleagues who were plotting against me as well. I can talk about this later, but one ardent Zionist who wanted to also have me gone. But I mean, the irony is that I guess her politics was okay. And she considered herself, a free speech advocate, but that's besides the point. But this sub-editor had, said, Palestine does not exist. Do I have to teach you how to be a journalist? You're not a journalist. And completely dressed me down. It was so humiliating. It was so patronizing. And again, being like a 23-year-old at the time, it was just incredibly, it just taken me aback. And I was very intimidated also by this grown man standing over me and yelling at me. And no one spoke up. No one around me said anything. No one, if he had come up to me and maybe talked about something completely different, he was just telling me off about something different, I would hope those colleagues would have interjected and have been like, what the fuck's going on? But he was shouting loudly for everyone to hear. And I obviously made my case. And he ended up storming off, and I left. I remember leaving the office and just sort of crying in the bathroom, just thinking, what the hell am I doing here? What have I gotten myself into? I got into journalism wanting to do good reporting, to tell people stories, and I was being subjected to that. And so that was really, really, it was really troubling. And I know that this sort of thing doesn't just occur to me. It's occurred to other Palestinian colleagues who live abroad in the US as well. Sorry, I've gone off on a complete tangent. The question was about, what was it about? The narrative, the theory about, yeah.
No, but that's great. Like everything that you've just said, your experiences, it's so enlightening and shocking at the same time. Now that you don't have these sub-editors per se to kind of block the things that you share, do you think that the mediums that you use are blocked or maybe limited, like with search engines, let's say, or I don't know, even just relying on your own reach that you create? Are you limited?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I one example that I think was raised with me by someone at Africa for Palestine was when model Bella Hadid had just posted a photo of her Palestinian father's passport that said that he was born in Palestine, and that was taken down because it violated Instagram community rules, or whatever the hell that means. And I think that's just one example of being censored online. And quite often, just even on Twitter, a lot of Palestinian accounts as well end up getting taken down, like Palestinian accounts from Palestine. And no, I even recall quite recently, I think about a year ago or so, that a bank that I am with, I found out through a friend of mine who organizes the Palestinian Film Festival in Australia, and wanted to send money to one of the filmmakers in Palestine because of buying the rights to show the movie. And I'm trying to recall exactly what it said, but instead of the usual go-to is the the Palestinian territories, right? But it said the occupied territories of Israel, or the territories of Israel. So it was like Israel and then the territories of Israel. And I was just like, what the hell? I mean, true enough, because, the West Bank and Gaza is essentially under Israeli military control. It's under Israeli control. So yeah, if you want to say that, say that. But I mean, that wasn't the substance of the statement. So we reached out. I used Twitter as a platform. I guess I'm much more inclined to use Twitter than, say, Facebook, only because it had been really helpful for me as a journalist, and they ended up changing it. We didn't hear from them, but when my friend went back to do it, I think a couple of weeks later, it was corrected. So yeah, I mean, I guess for me, social media has been, these other avenues, these other mediums have been really important as well. I don't want to discount their importance. It's given someone like me who, is the daughter of working class refugees, who has came up with no connections whatsoever, access to the entire world, and for the world to have access to what I have to say. And what I have to say isn't necessarily important, but what I have to say about, say, Palestine, and my family's history, and so on and so forth, and beyond Palestine. I mean, I do want to state and emphasize how important it is to see Palestine as an international struggle, and it's not just Palestine alone. There are people occupied in West Papua, there, in South Africa, of course. I mean, apartheid, there's still a kind of de facto apartheid taking place, but we are all in this together. So, I mean, I also just want to, I guess, reiterate that my social media isn't just necessarily on Palestine, but also, given the fact that I'm Palestinian and that this is very close to me, I have used that platform as a way to share that story. And in particular, because it's so hard as it is to just see anything on Palestine that's legit. You've got the New York Times, posting awful, disgusting opinion pieces, dehumanizing, Palestinians. And I mean, that's the extent of it, right? I mean, the reporting is very both sidesing it and essentially lays the blame on Palestinians. So yeah, I mean, it's a very complicated but simple thing, I suppose. Yeah, I'm still rambling, so you can stop me whenever you want.
No, that's perfect. That's actually such a nice segue into my final question for you, which is, what do you think needs to be done in these newsrooms, or what advice would you give to other independent journalists like yourself, especially during these times when news is focused on COVID, getting news about Palestine is difficult from a first-hand perspective because it's just so hard to get into, like you said. And yeah, like you said as well, support even from editors is difficult to get. So what do we do?
That is the golden question. Look, from my perspective, from my experience, don't be afraid of speaking out and speaking up. I always did. In some ways, the pressure from the Israeli interest lobby groups, and the fact that my career, especially as a a young person sort of starting out, continued to be this uphill battle. Eventually got to me mentally, emotionally. But editors, while they can often be resistant, will actually, I think, have quite a bit of respect for you if you speak up, you stand up, and you push back. So I last year, or the year before, the years have just blurred into each other. I think it was 2019. A young Palestinian woman from Palestine, 48. So she's a Palestinian with an Israeli passport, was in Melbourne, and she was, murdered in the most horrific way in Melbourne. And the reporting was, because she's got an Israeli passport, was that she was Israeli, right? And her family is Palestinian, and one, I guess, is one way of how the Palestinian identity is erased. Like, even in the most horrific of circumstances, her identity was, just completely skewed. And so I was working at the ABC at the time in not a permanent position. It was 60% of the people at the ABC are contracted because they have very little funding. That's a whole other story. And I had broken my spine at the time, so I was in a back brace, and I'm thankfully fully recovered. But I just remember seeing this and being like, this is completely fucked. And she was also living in Bak el Gharbiya, which is next to another Palestinian town. It used to be one entire town, but the apartheid wall runs right through it. So she's on the 48 side, behind the Green Line, or her family is. And so I got in contact with some family members to just cover the story as it is. And in my story, I wrote that she was a Palestinian citizen of Israel. And other outlets were calling her an Arab Israeli, blah, blah. And the outrage that came with it. And I was accused of weaponizing this young woman's death. But for me, I was talking to her family, and her family said, we are Palestinian. We are human first. One of her uncles told me, we are human first, and we are Muslim second. He was a bit religious, and we are Palestinian third. But of course, this is Palestine, this is Palestine, this will always be our land. But they were also in the precarious situation of having to send her body back home, right? And they had to deal with the Israeli embassy. So when they were speaking to, and this comes back to why diversity in newsrooms is quite important. When they were speaking to white journalists, they didn't correct them whatsoever. They were just kind of like, some of the white Australian journalists that spoke to them. When they were speaking to me, they were like, yeah, Palestine, Palestinian, where, of course, and they were sort of, pushing back. And unlike with some of the white journos or some of the non-Palestinian journalists, they were just kind of like, this is what happened. They weren't really focusing on that. But with me, they felt like they could talk about these things. And so, I took a stand, and I had the story published online, and I did get in trouble for it by one of the heads of the international department who I used to work with that person in another part of the ABC, who was livid, was just livid that how dare I, even though they have a correspondent in Jerusalem who, was covering the story but didn't get elements of the story that I had gotten, because I could speak Arabic, I could connect with the family, and it was more than just, a horrendous story. There was a lot more to it. And this person was just outraged. How could you? When in fact I was actually adding to the to the story, and covering even something like the funeral, which most journalists probably wouldn't do, and speaking to one of her sisters, and speaking to her extended family, and really trying to paint a picture of Aya and her family, and also the way that they live. And yeah, I also spoke to one of the people in editorial. I called him up, and I am, for all intents and purposes, a junior journalist at the time. And I was like, this is unacceptable to be referring to her as Israeli or even Arab Israeli. And there was I had mentioned that there was also a Pew poll of Palestinians who live in 48, and the majority of themselves prefer to be referred to as Palestinian and Palestinian citizens. And so, I made my case, and he was like, okay, all right. The email he ended up sending out to everyone was that, use Palestinian citizen of Israel, but if you use Arab Israeli, like, I'm not gonna, be mad. Which again was a sort of, lukewarm approach to it. But yeah, there was a lot of uproar. People who been running, like, there's an Australian guy who runs like a pro-Israel blog, wrote that I'm calling for the destruction of Israel, and just all these like smears. And someone from, I think, the embassy went to the ABC. Actually, I know they did, but it wasn't on the record, but I know that they did. So I'm just going to say it here, to speak to the head of the news outlet. And I mean, was it about me? Probably, because this has happened to me for so many years. And so it only feels like a rational conclusion to think that right after I had published these stories, that they had a meeting with the head of the news outlet. And I can only assume it was about me, because prior to that, and at another news outlet I was at, once a former boss had left, had confided in me, saying that when members of the Israeli Foreign Ministry had come to visit Australia, so they do their rounds, they visit politicians, they lobby, they visit some of the big media outlets, two members of the Foreign Ministry, because I had mentioned to him, I was like, they've just followed me on Twitter. I've got two members of the Foreign Ministry have followed me on Twitter. It's just weird, like one after the other. And my former boss at the time said, well, actually, they were here about a week ago, and they brought you up. You were on the agenda. And we tried to kind of like, this is ridiculous. It's like a young journalist that's just working with us. Like, why you're coming here from, the state of Israel, you're lobbying politicians, and you come to our news outlet, and your concern is our like 24-year-old journalist. I mean, that's a bit weird. I mean, like, why are you so obsessed? So yeah, I mean, I think sometimes, I'm very skeptical, and it's made me, I wouldn't say paranoid, but a lot more cautious. And, even now as I'm speaking, I'm sure that, I've tweeted this out, I put it up on social media. Interested parties in Australia would be tuning in. Hi. To know what I'm saying. But I lay it out all on the table. And I mean, to further answer your question, sorry, are we running out of time? Because I've, okay. I think it's also hard when you're a journalist, when you're trying to make a living, right? To stand up and to challenge. I mean, oftentimes the default reaction is to just put your head down and, you know, go continue to work quietly and sort of listen to the editors and not challenge. Why challenge if it's going to put you on the map and make you a target, say in the newsroom or by others externally? But being a journalist, I believe, and I know, is about standing on the right side of history and with justice and to hold power to account, and not being the megaphone or holding the megaphone for oppressive parties in general. And when we're talking about in situations of Palestine, Israel, I mean, yeah, just basically relaying a statement by the IDF and calling that journalism. So I understand that it's difficult, but if you don't say something, if you don't push back, I mean, who will? And I recall at one of the news outlets I was at, there was a story that I had pitched, and the chief of staff at the time, so the chief of staff rotates based on a roster, and the chief of staff was like, oh, you know, like it's a story, but I just don't want to deal with the backlash from any of the Israeli lobby groups. And, you know, she's like arming and eyeing, and then another journalist overheard, because I was speaking to her, and jumped in and was like, why should that stop, you know, Janine from pursuing this story? Like, why is that, like, so what? That they complain about things all the time. I mean, that shouldn't be a reason. But it goes to show you that there's so much apprehension and hesitation. So stories don't even have the chance to go out there to even face complaints sometimes, because you have editors and chiefs of staff and journalists just censoring themselves. And so there's a real chill effect that's happening in newsrooms in Australia, in the West in general. And, you know, I'm really grateful to the other journalists who, you know, chimed in and stood up for me. And the story didn't end up happening. Of course, you know, like news just moves quite fast where I was at the time. And yeah, and there was still quite a lot of apprehension. And I just thought, okay, I will pick it up another time. So I also think that some of the most important things that we can do is to follow Palestinian journalists, Palestinian news outlets. I mean, I know a lot of them are in Arabic. There are a couple in English. Something like 972 Mag is quite good, out of, you know, 48 Palestine, aka what is known as modern Israel today, but it'll always be Tmanu Arbaeen for me and my people, and also people living in Palestine, from the river to the sea, who do share their experiences online, and platforming them and engaging with them. I think that's a good way to sort of support these kinds of stories. And some of the things, it's one of the few things that can be done in newsrooms or by independent journalists.
True. And it definitely takes a lot of strength, and your stories have just been pretty shocking, to be honest. So yeah, it sums up very well what happens in the news, in the media, and shows how important it is. So thank you for sharing with us and just everything that you do. Is there anything else you want to share or let people know where to find and follow you?
I mean, I could talk for such a long time, as you can tell. But I just wanted to say thank you so much for having me on. I mean, I'm honored. I often joke that I'm just like a Twitter shit poster. Like I'm no one. So it's nice that I guess you've heard me out. I mean, some random in on this island colony. But yeah, I guess if you want to follow some of the things that I share or have to say, I am on Twitter at Janine AK. So that's JENNINEAK. And yeah, I hope this was also edifying, and you know, I hope to to speak about this more as well. I mean, some of the things that I've said here, I haven't said publicly because I was always trying to decide or figure out the right time to talk about some of these things. And, you know, it's difficult. And I think I carry a little bit of, you know, trauma. I mean, obviously it's not raw reporting or anything, but just the feeling of being constantly sort of followed, monitored, surveilled, you know, everything that I said or did. It was just really, really stifling. So yeah, I thank you, Africa for Palestine. Thank you, Shannon. You've been amazing and asking all the right questions. Yeah, and I can't wait to see what you guys do next and who you have on next, because you often platform a lot of incredible speakers. So yeah, just excited for that.
Thank you so much. We have Gideon Levy tomorrow. So that's going to be a big one.
So cool. Yeah, that's awesome. All right. Yeah. Well, that's great. Amazing.
Thank you.